Okay, folks, why don't we get started this evening? For those that don't know me, I'm Professor Steve Sicoli. This is the Great Decisions class, IS 235. So welcome. I know we have some visiting students tonight. I'm so glad you could join us. This is actually an encore lecture relative to our lecture last week on Russian domestic politics by Professor Sasha Kostina. It's my great pleasure tonight to introduce my colleague, Professor Nikolaos Zahariadis, tonight's lecture. Professor Zahariadis joined the Rhodes International Studies Department back in 2016 as the Mertie W. Buckman Distinguished Professor of International Studies. Prior to coming to Rhodes, he spent 17 years at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. Professor Zahariadis has a really interesting substantive focus, really the intersection of three areas of European politics, of public policy, and of political economy. And those three areas nicely coincide for this evening's lecture. And he's got a lot for us to think about when it comes to Russia-Ukraine relations and what's transpired over the past week. So let me keep this introduction very short because there's a lot to think about and a lot to talk about. The format will be the same. We will hear from Professor Zahariadis. We'll take a break, and we really look forward to your questions and conversation for this evening. Okay, and I should point out that tonight's lecture is being recorded on Zoom, so we can make it available for other international studies students. So, Professor Zahariadis, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Professor Sicoli. And here is the first surprise of the day. I'm going to take the mask off because I can. And to be brutally honest, it feels so good not to have to wear this for 2 hours. So I'm not going to. I wish I were eating, so I would have a reason not to take it off. But that's all right. This is the next best thing. The new rules allow me to do so. So thank you for tolerating my presence without the mask. What I want to talk to you today is about the situation in Ukraine. I know you've had another lecture where you've gotten a different point of view. This will be a different point of view from that lecture. It's not necessarily a better point of view, but it is necessarily a different point of view. What that means is it will make you think in different ways. It will point to different aspects of the issue, and hopefully will get you to ponder about some issues that I think are very important. Part of my thinking about all of this stuff is because I thought that the lecture that I was supposed to give you on industrial policy, while I love that stuff, I don't know whether you guys would find it as interesting as the topic on the Ukraine, because it really is very important right now, and it does have tremendous impact on us. And so I thought it would be a good idea for us to have a chat on it. What I'm going to do is make some comments about the issue from a sort of a holistic perspective, if you'd like. What I'll do is talk to you a little bit about the history. You need to have a sense of what happened before you can start to understand what actually is happening now, what's driving some of these issues. Then we'll talk about the issues. There will be plenty of maps for those of you, for the cartographer, the crypto cartographer in you. And there will be room for a whole lot of discussion. I'll try to sort of stop after a certain while, and maybe we can have a little bit of a conversation, the material that I talked about, just to break the monotony so you don't get to hear me for an hour straight, and so that I don't talk for an hour straight. And hopefully it will all be fine. I have one question. Do we need to turn this on? Is the microphone on?
You see the blue light?
I see the blue light. The microphone is.
Look that light on.
Yes, please. Yes. So here are some things that we are going to be discussing. Sort of the questions that I thought I would try to answer with you. The first one is, why did Russia invade the Ukraine? Well, you know, that's a very good question to ask, especially since this seems to have caught the public, not the attentive public, but the public by surprise. You know, what exactly is happening over there, and why is there such calamity in that part of the world? Then we're going to ask the question, well, why now? What's the big deal about now? You need to also understand about timing, and international affairs and questions, especially of war and peace, are all about timing. We also are going to talk about the infamous "so what" question. What are the consequences? All of this stuff is happening. How will it affect us? Does it matter to us? Should we care? I mean, it's a world away, but really it does make a difference, and we'll talk about in what ways. And finally, I wanted us to sort of think about what do we do next? Because at the end of the day, some of this stuff will be very academic, meaning that it sort of looks back, but really what's important is how to move forward. And with this particular situation, what can we do as individual citizens? And should we lobby our politicians? Is there something that we should expect more out of our politicians? That's about the most we can hope for. Underneath here, I have a sort of an equation. That's about the only equation you'll ever see on this slide. And that is the propensity to declare war. Essentially what describes it. And I will organize my presentation on that basis. So the propensity to declare war equals motives. You got to have motives. You got to have a reason. Wars never start accidentally per se. There's always an underlying reason. It's not that you stepped on somebody's foot. There is much more to it than that. The second thing is about capabilities. You got to have the capability to conduct war. Otherwise, you don't declare it. It's going to be a very, very tricky scenario if you go to war without being 100% prepared. And if you want to know what that means in practice, think of the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the infamous "you go to war with the army you have." Well, that wasn't good enough, Mr. Rumsfeld. And it wasn't good enough in that we were not prepared, essentially, with the kind of war that we encountered in that part of the world. And for the day after, primarily, you've got to think about the day after and what that means. So capabilities are important. Opportunity, timing is critical. You can do it sometimes and it will maximize your chances of winning, and other times when it will not. You've got to also calculate the consequences. You can be assured that President Putin and his advisors very, very much calculated the consequences. They weighed the pros and cons and made the decision based on what they thought was best in terms of what they want. We're not exactly sure what they want. They haven't advertised what they want, but we can have a fair sort of understanding, thinking about what it is. And so it's more for those of you who know a little bit about this stuff. It's about expected utility. You sort of expect how it will all play out, how it helps you, and in what ways. And you have to have clear preferences with this decision on war. You got to know what it is you want. You may not say it, you may not share that part, but you got to know for yourself. And you've got to have obviously coercive means. You cannot conduct warfare strictly by begging, please, please, please. You're not going to talk people to death. You got to find other ways to do so. It is also, however, and that sort of moves away from this expected utility stuff, you got to also talk about propaganda. War is probably the classic example of misinformation. You've got to control the narrative of what it is about. I mean, there are events happening on the ground. Stuff is happening in the Ukraine. You've got to, as a leader, explain it. And you've got to explain it to your own people domestically, but you also have to explain it internationally to the other side, to the outside world, because you need support on the outside, which is where he probably miscalculated, President Putin, I mean. But it's about propaganda, and that sort of moves us away from expected utility into other issues such as constructivism and beyond. So I will make 3 points and I will draw 2 conclusions from it. The first one is that the decision has been years in the making. It's nothing new. It is not something that he thought up this week, last month, last year, last couple of years. It has been at least a decade, because we know they've been hoarding foreign reserves, essentially hard currency, for at least 8 years, which means that they came up with a plan long before it. And this is part of the long strategy of trying to prepare for the consequences. It tells us that he's been preparing for it for a while, and that does make a difference. Domestic politics and propaganda play an important role in all foreign policy decisions, including war. What I'm trying to explain here, what I'm trying to tell you is, we normally think of war as addressing issues out there in the environment, in the Ukraine. There's something happening, and therefore President Putin, assuming he's the only one participating in all of this, needs to react somehow because he saw a problem. That's not necessarily the only thing that matters. In fact, the closer you get to a democracy, the more you realize that domestic politics makes a bigger difference, actually, than what's happening outside your country, because voters matter. They're the ones who keep you in power. You've got to placate them. You've got to talk to them. You've got to make sure that it makes sense to them, because at the end of the day, you'll ask them for their support, and you need to have their support. So there's a whole lot of domestic politics going on here, not only in Russia, mind you, but also in European countries as well as the US. President Biden has also made a calculated move to talk about this in the way that he has. So nothing is off the cuff, so to speak. Everything is calculated in that they realized what was happening. I'm talking about the US and the EU, and they've decided to respond in a particular way after very serious discussion and after calculating the consequences domestically as well. At the end of the day, they're going to have to pay the price. We are going to have to pay the price. And we need to figure out what that is and whether we're willing to do so. Finally, I wanted to sort of reinforce the point, not that it is not talked about, but this is all about a projection of power, demonstration of power. It's classic realism at its absolute best. And I have a quote from Thucydides, who's supposed to be the father of classical realists. He's an Athenian writer who wrote in the 5th century BC about the Peloponnesian War, which is essentially an account of the war between Sparta and Athens that lasted for a long time. And what makes his work very important is that he not only talked about history in the sense that this is what happened, that is what happened, he said that, she said that. It's almost impossible to think that he would know what everybody said, had written it down, and so that he could write it all. So some of that stuff surely he made up. But he also went into explaining motives, talking about rationale. Why is all of this stuff happening? And why is it important? And that's what made it unique, his contribution unique. And one of the things that he said in a part of in a section of what he's talking about is about the strong do what they can and the weak do what they must. Essentially saying that this is all about power. And if you are strong, you'll get your way. And if you're weak, tough luck. You gotta suffer the consequences. And what's happening, this is about the siege of Milos. Essentially, it's a small island. The Athenians asked them to surrender. The millions said no. Then he's talking about the conversation between the two. They offered them to surrender, or else they will raise it to the ground. The millions then decided, well, okay, we'll surrender. Then the Athenians raised them to the ground. If it reminds you of something that's happening right now, it probably should, because it's not quite the same thing, obviously, but there's a whole lot of the same logic going on right now. Finally, the two conclusions. The conclusions are the Ukraine and the West have very few good options right now about what to do, how to save face and push back the invasion, assuming that pushing back the invasion is what we want. That is, we don't want Russia there. In general, the generic we. Finally, insofar as Russia is concerned, is it a Pyrrhic victory for Russia? Yes, they're going to win. I mean, you'll just to spare you the thunder that will come later on, they're likely to win. They're likely to get what they want because they have the power to do so, and they're mobilizing it to do so. The question is at what cost? And so what we need to discuss is whether the cost will be too high for them. Yes, you get what you want, but sometimes you wish you didn't. All right, so let's go into the details. It's been years in the making. I've got 3 maps. The first one, go from the right, upper right-hand corner, then we go left, and then bottom right. The upper right-hand corner gives you an idea of sort of the history in the 8th and 9th century. Now, why should I care about the 8th and 9th century? Because that's when the Rus, who are the people, the precursors of the Russians, first appeared in recorded history. And they are people who are of Scandinavian descent. They essentially came from Scandinavia all the way down to the Ukraine. Partly because if you know anything about Scandinavia, the darn place is cold and it's full of ice, and the Ukraine is not. So what's not to like? And the Ukraine is actually fairly fertile, so it was much easier life. Essentially, that's what it was. Plus, they were in the trade routes between the Byzantine Empire to the south and Scandinavia to the north. So it was profitable, let's put it that way. Notice what I'm saying. They are the Rus, precursors of the Russians, but also precursors of the Ukrainians because they actually were in the Ukraine. In fact, they're called the Kievan Rus. It helps explain why there is an overlap between the two. Hence, Putin talked about we're one people. He's referring to all of these issues that we came sort of from the same ethnic group. We just happened to divide, and now we need to reunite, but on my terms. So it gives you a sense of some of the sort of medieval history of what was going on at the time. Now, you can see, I hope, a dark green line that gives you today's borders, Ukraine's today's borders, so that you can see what is happening relative to where the Ukraine is today. Moving now to the 1700s. How's that for a history lesson in like a minute? Now over to the 1700s. And what's happening over there, you can see, are a couple of things. Number one, most of the area, essentially the area that's part of the Ukraine, and now a bunch of it is Belarusia and Russia, was actually taken over by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So you've got other East European countries involved in all of this, and moving as far as the Crimea at some point, but being pushed back, mainly slowly, but certainly surely, by Russia as the czars begin acquiring these lands over the years. And you can see sort of the timing of all of this stuff. It's happening in the 17th and 18th century. All of this is happening in the 17th and 18th century as Russia begins to expand southward. It also gives you, please notice where Moscow is, so that you can have a better sense of the geography of why Russia is expanding in that area. and not sort of to the east, which is essentially Siberia. And to them, for the most part, it didn't really matter because it was empty land, the steppes, etc. And so they were interested in primarily coming down to the Ukraine, partly because it was fertile land. It was essentially about food and security. Security, you have to secure your southern border against possible invasion. Notice how the Ottoman Empire was to the south as well, plus Austro-Hungary was further to the west, expanding at the time. So it makes sense why the Tsars would move in that direction. Fast forward now to 1922. We're past World War I, and some things have happened. Notice where Poland is now. It has been shrunk dramatically from the Commonwealth, the way it used to be. And what it talks about the Brest-Litovsk treaty over there, so that you know what that is. It was a treaty that they signed with the Axis powers, the Central Powers, essentially Germany, Austria-Hungary, that took Russia out of the war in 1917, but also enabled the Ukraine to have help by the Germans to rebuild the country, and to an extent they were fighting against the Reds while the civil war was being waged in Russia. So what you're having over there up until 1922 is a civil war that also engulfed the Ukraine. So let's pull all of this together, and we'll go through each of these points that I made to give you a better sense of what is happening and why. So the title of the presentation is Fast Forward to the Past. Essentially, much of the answer is buried in the past. That's what I'm trying to tell you. So you need to understand a little bit, at least, of the past. So part of the motivation is past problems. Number one, you need to remember, I gave you the maps, and I did tell you about the Russians and then the Ukraine, etc. But you've got to remember, nations did not exist at that time. Nations were created essentially in the 19th century. Nations, the way we understand the national awakening of people in Europe, happened in the 19th century. So we do use the same terms for years before that, and we use them interchangeably as if these people meant the same thing. That is, they identified as Russian in the way that the Russians identify themselves today, or as Ukrainian in the way that the Ukrainians identify themselves today. They didn't. So keep that all in mind. Russia lays claims to the area since the 10th century. So you can see why Putin, in his argument, his presentation, it wasn't crazy what he was saying. He was talking to his own people. They know all of this stuff. They're taught this stuff since day one at school. So they understand what he's talking about. This is our land. To most of them, it seems reasonable. To the rest of the world, it doesn't, because it seems as if you're coveting sort of your neighbor's wells and fields and stuff. To him, he's not. I'm just trying to explain. I'm not necessarily justifying it. I'm just trying to explain why that is happening. The Ukraine has suffered significantly from invasions. It was unfortunately in an area that suffered from invasions of all sorts of people moving across, that is, from the steppes of Asia into Europe and being pushed back from Europe into Asia. And you have the Tatars, the Hungarians, the Poles. They've all come as invaders. Some of them stayed, some of them left. So the whole area has suffered dramatically. Initially, now we're fast forward into the 20th century. We are going through the Civil War. We're in the middle of the Russian Civil War. The Tsar has been toppled, and we're fighting for control now of Russia. Essentially, initially they opposed the Reds, the Bolsheviks, and then fought with them. And it was declared an autonomous republic that joined the USSR in 1922. That's why he was referring, that's what he meant by referring to Lenin's mistake. Essentially, his mistake was to declare the Ukraine an autonomous Soviet republic, to give it that is substance, and to declare it actually a nationality. I mean, the very fact that he had a republic also entitled them to be a nationality separate from the Russian majority. What we see here is that there is considerable animosity against the communists and their successors. Well, guess who is their successors? The Russians. So there is tension built into from years past, even though it was not framed in today's terms. But there is still that tension of Moscow telling us what to do. And we need to oppose it. It suffered greatly from a man-made famine. They essentially were decimated in 32, 33, died by the millions. Once again, blamed the Russians, who were running essentially the USSR, Stalin. They blamed them for their predicament. Yet again, tension is building between now two opposing peoples, if you like. Finally, we get to your favorite, World War II. What happened in World War II? The sad thing is, when the Germans invaded Russia, they went toward Moscow, but primarily they moved to the south toward the Ukraine because it was much easier. And they had far greater success. They took over Kiev and established a puppet regime. Why the Ukraine? If you look at where it is, again, look at the maps and what's happening. If you see, it is right across the Black Sea, across modern-day Turkey at the time. It was the Ottoman Empire, which is very close to the Middle East. Essentially, what they wanted was access to the Middle East. That's what the Nazis were thinking about. We want access to oil fields, and the Ukraine does have some oil, but it also has access to other areas in the Middle East. And so they moved in that direction. The difference here is that many Ukrainians greeted the Nazis as liberators because they couldn't stand the Bolsheviks. Remember the famine, et cetera, et cetera. So they greeted the Nazis as liberators, partly because the Nazis stood against the Bolsheviks, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and against the Poles, who used to run the show a couple of hundred years back. Notice how a couple of hundred years is like yesterday in that part of the world. So they greeted them as liberators, and that helps explain the denazification, why sort of the Nazis are a very important theme that keeps being played by Putin. Now, let's talk a little bit about the external threats. All of that was internal and in the past. I want to talk a little bit about the external dimension to show you how and why you have significant problems from the perspective of Russia now. That's the key. You've got to see it as a Russian. In the left, you have NATO and its expansion. Essentially, you have the before and the after. Before 97 and after 97. Or if you want to think about it in sort of cruder terms, is during the Cold War and after the Cold War. Notice what happened after the Cold War. So the Cold War ends in 1989, 90. We do have the New York Times outside to prove it. that it did happen. The Berlin Wall fell, and good things happened, at least for a short while. Part of what was going on in world politics, and especially in the security architecture of Europe, was trying to decide who's with us, who's against us. Part of the problem with the old architecture of the Cold War is that it was of two very defined camps. You had sort of the Soviet bloc, and you had the good guys. Well, the good guys won. Hooray to us. The Soviet bloc, the bad guys, lost. Now you have no enemy, which is an even bigger problem, because you've got to decide what to do. You've got all of these guns, you've got this alliance, you've got all of these plans, and you've got no enemy to shoot at. What happened during that time was many East European countries, that is former Soviet bloc countries, saw their opportunity to move away from Soviet, or by that time Russian domination, into the Western sphere, arguing that we used to be part of the broader sort of area or territory of Europe. We want to join back the way things used to be. Sort of this post-World War II era was a brief interlude. It didn't matter. What we want to do is go before that time to the way things used to be. And we are European again, meaning we're not under Russian domination. So many of them applied to join NATO. At the time, I still want to call them the Soviet Union because they're behaving like a Soviet Union. But Russia at the time, we're 1990s now, raised alarms about them leaving. Its sphere of influence, because it felt vulnerable. To understand the vulnerability, you have to understand how Russia always perceived itself under threat from major European powers. It used to be Poland. Remember in the 1700s how it expanded and then contracted because the Russians slowly kept gaining some of the territory. It was Germany. It was France under Napoleon. So there were consistent invasions. There was something to be said about that. So the way that they thought they would solve their problem, their security problem, was primarily via buffer states. So we take control over states that are not Russia, but neighbor Russia. We neutralize them, and essentially they do the dirty work for us so that we don't suffer before the enemy comes close, that we have some way, some lead time to prepare ourselves for a possible invasion. 1997 messes up those plans, essentially calls for a complete reconceptualization of the security architecture, because many of the former Soviet countries, Poland, Soviet bloc countries, Poland, Romania, the Baltic states, actually became NATO members. Russia was appalled, but he couldn't do anything. He was very, very weak. Yeltsin was in power at the time, and he did not like what he was seeing, but there was very little that he could do, partly because we had made a deal with him a couple of years before that with the Ukraine and security issues. You have to remember one thing about the Ukraine that's also very important. In 1994, the US, the UK, and Russia signed an agreement guaranteeing the security of the Ukraine. And the reason was because the Ukraine was a nuclear superpower. A lot of Soviet missiles, nuclear missiles, were actually left in the Ukraine after it collapsed. And therefore, we needed to do something about it. And they signed the agreement, arguing that the agreement said, we will give up the nuclear weapons provided that you give us guarantee about the territorial integrity of our state. You protect us. And we said yes, and the Brits said yes, and so did Russia. So part of what is happening is in direct violation, obviously, of that day. But you can also see how Russia now is starting to feel encircled. And it's turning them paranoid if you see it from their perspective, the way that they conceptualize their security. To drive the point home, I have the map on the right. The map on the right tells you NATO forces, where they're stationed. And it gives you a very clear idea what they're after. So even though we told the Russians that this is really not against you, it's about protecting NATO members, if you see it from the Russian perspective, it is against them. It clearly says that don't move, don't do anything, don't do this. And if you think, if you're Russian and you're paranoid that the West is coming to get me, what you're seeing is the precursor to an invasion. They will attack. And you can see how, again, it reinforces this feeling of encirclement and, if you want, paranoia. So, just to sort of pull everything together, there are external reasons in terms of motivations, and there's an existential security threat that they feel posed by NATO. I mean, to them, that's very important. We can say whatever it is we want. We can say, no, it's not directed against Russia. Putin, don't worry about it. We're not going to invade you. But they're not going to hear it because that's not what they believe in. Their core belief is this is set up against us. And unfortunately, we've done pretty much everything that we could to make sure that we reinforce this is set up against them. I mean, most of what we have done in Europe since the end of the Cold War is probably justifiably showing them that there is something going on and they need to be worried. We talked about 1994 and the security guarantees that were given at the time. I fast forward to 04, 05 to show you a little bit of sort of Russian meddling now, direct meddling in the Ukraine. Goes beyond security stuff. And now you're talking about good old-fashioned political assassinations and stuff. The Orange Revolution. Essentially what happened was that there were elections for president, and it was a Russian-backed president, Yanukovych, who did not win the election, and that did not sit well with Moscow. So they engineered a coup, and that brought people on the streets pushing back against what they perceived to be Russian meddling, caused the president to flee to Moscow, where else, and installing what was a pro-Western regime, if you'd like, a regime that flirted with the idea of NATO membership eventually, and European Union membership eventually. Two ironies here. One is eventually Yanukovych, the guy who fled, became president in 2010. So go figure that. But also what I'm showing you here is how the vote split, the presidential vote split. You look at the territories. East Ukraine mostly voted for Yanukovych. West Ukraine voted for Yushchenko, essentially for his opponent, the pro-Western guy. If you look at what the Russians are trying to do right now and where they have the most support, that's exactly what it is. This map tells you everything you ever wanted to know about where you're going to find mostly friendly Russian people and unfriendly Russian people in the Ukraine. Finally, in 2008, a major blunder by President Bush, who said that it would be a good idea to offer membership, NATO membership to the Ukraine, which was a great thing for the Ukrainians, but if you don't mean it, don't say it. And that's part of the problem. It raised expectations and raised alarms, and nothing was going to happen. So it unnecessarily complicated things, but it fed the fears that the Russians said that the West is cooking up something. Now, there are also economic motives in all of this stuff. It's not about high politics. It's also about low politics. For example, the economy. Now, the economy is not weak. It's relatively okay. And in some ways, it's better than ours. But in other ways, it's not. Think of the war as a diversionary tactic. That is, if you're having problems at home, start a war that you can win. Make sure you can win it. And that sort of stifles the opposition. Everybody rallies around the flag, if you want. And people start thinking about other things rather than all the bad things that you have done and how terrible you are. So part of what may be happening over there is this sort of a diversionary tactic. The Russian economy has been going up and down, and particularly since the Great Recession, but also the COVID pandemic, it has taken a blow. It has not yet recovered. All of these numbers and all of that stuff is approximate. With Russia, as well as with China, they publish numbers. We're not exactly sure how accurate they are. We take their word for it, but we're not sure because there is no independent verification. There is no consistent methodology that is appropriate to how we interpret these items to be measured, how they should be measured. So the biggest problem that they have is that it's a non-diversified economy. And that's what hurts them the most. By a non-diversified economy, I mean it's an economy that relies basically on just a few items, a few sectors to provide most of the wealth. You destroy those sectors for one reason or another, and the economy goes down the tubes. The whole thing goes down the tubes. And that's a huge problem. And Russia actually is mainly an extractive economy, which is really bad because it relies mainly on mining. It has, very, very rich natural resources, but primarily oil and gas, which it sells, and it gets considerable foreign exchange for it. And we'll talk about especially the natural gas in a minute. And all of that has been happening since the 1970s, since they started pumping a whole lot of oil, especially from Siberia, into the world markets, and natural gas in the 80s and 90s into Western Europe. They have been making a killing because it's a whole lot of money. They're essentially providing most of the energy needs for much of Europe or European economy, and that's a whole lot. But that necessarily creates a problem. Just like all Middle Eastern countries have found out the hard way, if something goes wrong with the oil industry or with the gas industry, then you suffer. Then your whole economy suffered. And that is oil demand decreased in 2020, partly because the economy's plummeted everywhere because of COVID. That means not enough money. That means your economy takes a nosedive in ways that are structural. You cannot make it up because you've lost especially hard currency. It's not domestically produced. It's brought from abroad, foreign reserves primarily, and that makes a huge difference. Borrowing nearly doubled, and borrowing in hard currency, which means that you have to generate hard currency to pay it back if you want access to foreign markets, which is difficult, which means that you have to sell more oil, more natural gas. And they've started hoarding. We know in the last 8 years, the central bank has started hoarding foreign reserves, and they've amassed estimates of $630 billion worth, but they have access to about half of it now, and we'll talk about why in a minute. So you have all of these reserves, and you're wondering, why are they putting all of this, stashing essentially all of this money in safe places? Well, now we know why. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Inflation is going up 8%, but it's going to go up significantly. I have former students in Moscow, and they're telling me that they're starting to see lines, they're starting to see prices going up significantly, and they're not happy about it. Now, whether they'll do anything, I don't know, but they're certainly not happy. They're expressing displeasure. Nevertheless, and that's very important for us to remember, Putin continues to have a very high approval rating. So no matter what we say, he has a high approval rating in a place like Russia. And again, you got to take these numbers with a grain of salt, but they're high relative. And I put President Biden next to it, who does not have such a high rating. So between the two of them, who is much stronger domestically, politically, and who's not, I'll let you figure it out. But the numbers give you a very interesting picture. Now, let's talk about capabilities, because at the end of the day, as we said, it's all about strength. That is, you start a war, mainly you have reasons to start it, but if you don't have the capabilities, it doesn't really matter. There's nothing you can do about it. To the left, it tells you where the positions of the estimated positions of the Russian troops are, and the new ones that have come. All of that in orange. If you look at it, they're encircling the Ukraine. And that helps explain why in the last couple of weeks you have heard President Biden and others complaining all about these Russian military exercises. It looks very much like an invasion. And, you know, in hindsight, if it walks like a duck and if it quacks like a duck, it is a duck. And essentially all of that was to try to build as many forces as there in order to have the propitious time to sort of move ahead. Notice one more thing, a fair number of new troops are actually placed in Belarus, which tells you what side they are on. And if you want to know why they're on that side, go back a couple of months. Some of you may remember the Ryanair airline incident, which it was diverted to actually pick out the dissident into Minsk. The only one who supported it was Putin. So you know there's collaboration there. And this may be part of, you scratch my back, now I'm going to scratch yours. To the right hand, you see troop movements. Now, that's not sort of the most recent one, but it gives you an idea of where they've come and what it is they're trying to do. Notice in the south, it almost overlaps completely with the territories that voted for the pro-Russian candidate in the Orange Revolution. I mean, exactly that. And in the north, what you see is essentially they're going after Kiev, the capital. And part of the strategy is you take out the capital, you take out the head of the beast, so to speak, and then you can install your own government and you have a different set of possibilities available to you. Before that, you've got to move toward the capital. And that helps explain why so many troops were amassing in Belarus. It's much quicker to actually move towards Kiev from there rather than from the Crimea, which they had already annexed in years past. Or the rebel-held territories, which you can actually see over here, and where you actually have your own people over there. I mean, paramilitaries, separatists who support you. I mean, you've got it all over there. And those territories, I can assure you, will expand. Meaning influence in those territories will expand. Now, let's talk a little bit about the opportunity. You know, why now? We've talked about why. We've talked about how, the capabilities. Let's talk very briefly about why now. And there is a propitious time to do things. It's called the policy window in public policy, in the public policy literature, that tells you that some things happen and they're more likely to happen because the timing is right. So let's examine the timing. I'm giving you the past peacekeeping missions just to tell you that the timing of yet another peacekeeping mission is actually easy to understand. You're following a long series of sending troops elsewhere for reasons that you have created quite often. And what you have there, some of you may not even know some of this stuff, is in 92 Transnistria, which is in Moldova, sort of a slice of land that's sandwiched between Moldova and the Ukraine. That's mainly run by Russian separatists, Russophiles. There are Russian troops staying there. And interestingly enough, just one minor digression, they actually bind to the Soviet Union. They have the hammer and the sickle and Lenin statue. I mean, you know, the full meal deal over there, which is really odd. I mean, it's a country sort of frozen in time. 93, you have South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia. That is, you've sent troops, peacekeeping troops over there. In 2008, you have the celebrated sending troops into Russia, which the Russians created. Actually, they helped the separatists cause trouble, provoke the Georgian military. The military responded, and the Russian peacekeepers are going in there to restore peace and help their brothers across the border. I mean, it's a very, very easy thing to understand and something that they have done over and over again. You have in 2014 in the Ukraine, Crimea, which was eventually annexed in Donbass, which is the two regions bordering Russia in eastern Ukraine. Same exact things. You have in 2021, and those you do remember, in Kazakhstan with everything that was going on. Now, they were invited under CIS rules, but it kind of makes you wonder what exactly was happening. We never understood what was happening. But to me, at least, the way I would interpret it, given what I know now, given what I knew then, given what I've seen here, it's part of one more exercise in influence, just showing to people that I have influence and I will do things that help support my proteges, whatever they may be. Which is exactly what the Soviet Union used to do. The Brezhnev Doctrine is exactly that. I mean, that's exactly what it said. Take the idea of communism out and throw in my brothers, my Russians, my cousins, whoever it is. But it's very similar ideas. Finally, in 2022 in the Ukraine, again, so the opportunity is essentially so many peacekeeping missions that are creating the expectation, which one is next? Now, why now specifically? It is after the Beijing Winter Olympics. Now, why is that important? Because he needed to make a deal with the Chinese. Essentially, if you look at Russia, it has two fronts. One is China, especially since China is developing at very high rates, and therefore it does have power, and he needs to consult with them. And the other is the U.S., primarily sort of the West in general. So he wanted to make sure that with China, nothing went wrong. Now, why not invade the Ukraine before the Winter Olympics? Because it would have messed up the Winter Olympics, and the Chinese were determined to make sure they put on a show. It wasn't exactly what they had hoped, but nevertheless, it was a show that celebrated China. So he wanted to make sure, well, nothing like that happened. Once they're over, guess what? The switch is on, and now I get to do what I want. And so they cemented a deal of cooperation, and part of it may be seen now in the Chinese response, which has been very muted, and only recently have they said, well, we support the territorial integrity of states, but never condemning the Russian invasion. Any questions so far about anything we've said? let's take, is it a 5 or 10-minute break?
Yeah, we'll take, how about 10 minutes?
10 minutes. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll be back with more fun and entertainment. And questions. Thank you.
Things up here. Up here more. I gotta pause record. Okay.
All right. Yeah. Should have done it earlier. We're back with the opportunity. Okay, so we talked about the motives. We talked about the capabilities. We're trying to finish up with the opportunity, and we said that it's the peacekeeping missions, essentially what was going on, plus the end of the Beijing Games, Winter Olympic Games, and that gave sort of the perfect opportunity for Putin to put into place his plan, because he definitely had a plan. So up to now, do you have any questions? Is there something that we can talk about, something that we need to explain that I did not explain as well? Yes.
So in terms of propaganda, we kind of saw today on the UN floor talks of what's actually going on and what families of Russian troops believe is going on with their soldiers and what's actually happening. Is that also a form of propaganda in a way, or is that a way of them just kind of sheltering what's actually going on with Russian troops?
Everything is propaganda, and we're engaged in as much propaganda as they are, because we're trying to control the narrative as much as they are. And some of what you read is probably true. I mean, I have no reason to deny it, but some of it, I am sure, may be made up, just like they're making up stuff all the time. And it is all about controlling the narrative, making the narrative fit the kind of purposes that you have set for yourself. Provided that you have clear goals, then the narrative becomes a lot easier to sort of implement through these information and misinformation. And that's the problem. We don't know which one is information. We don't know which one is misinformation, at least now. Any other questions? I'm so incredibly clear that you got it. You know, you're thinking, yeah, this is awesome. Okay, if this is awesome, here is some more awesomeness for you. All right, so the calculus of consequences, right? You've decided I'm going to do it, but the one thing that you have to sort of keep in mind is what's going to happen when I do it, because obviously that's risky business, and it means that it can come back to haunt you. So you've got to choose your enemies carefully. Number one, make sure you win. Very important, as the Argentinians found out in the Falklands War in 1982. Very important. But also calculate what others will do in order for you not to suffer as much. You want to optimize benefits and minimize costs. So you look back into what happened at times when you did somewhat similar things. Nothing is the same. Contrary to the popular saying, history does not repeat itself. It doesn't quite do it in the same way. There's always some different spin, almost always bad spin rather than good spin. So there are episodes from years past that he can draw from and see what happened. In 2008, you have the invasion of Georgia regarding Ossetia and Abkhazia. The separatist shell villages, this actually picture is from Russians entering that area. Separatist shell villages, Georgians respond, and then the Russian troops invade to make peace. I mean, how is that for creating a problem that you then step in to solve? Everybody knew what was going on. The problem is you've got the situation on the ground that you've got to deal with. You are now the West. How do you address this issue? And I have there some responses, some country responses. It's not everything. It's not meant to be comprehensive. Some countries heavily condemned Russia. Some countries refrained from doing so. Yes, they are bad, but yeah, we'll see. Maybe there is more to it than we know. And you see France and Germany being part of that group. NATO increased its presence in the Black Sea. That's important. But crucially, no action. Essentially, Putin got what he wanted out of Georgia. Georgia is now under his sphere of influence, and that was part of the issue actually over there. And no question about it, with the West, if you like, not making any moves to counter that, to say anything. Essentially, we agreed, okay, this is your area of influence. You can do almost everything that you want. Not everything, but almost. So consequences number two. You have in now 2014, fast forward, in the Ukraine, you have the Donbas region and you have the Crimea region. Essentially what happened in Crimea is you have pro-Russian, the pro-Russian president of the Ukraine was deposed, ousted. And you have essentially Russia saying that we are going to give Crimea, return Crimea back to the motherland. Remember that Crimea plays a big role in Russian history. Interestingly enough, also in Greek history, because there's a whole lot of Greeks over there, back from the Argonauts and Jason, et cetera, et cetera. But it is mainly inhabited by Russian speakers. So for the most part, the Ukraine was seen to many of the local population as a foreign entity. And why should we live in a foreign entity where Mother Russia is right across the channel? And it was the Crimea was actually part of Russia proper, and it was given to the Ukraine in 1954. So they could argue that what we are doing is we are righting a wrong that existed. So essentially the way to do this is uprising, hold an uprising, get rid of the current government, install a new government, call for a referendum, get the result that you want, problem solved. Which is exactly what happened. And it was formally annexed and recognized as part of Russia at the end of, I think, August of, no, I annexed in March. I stand corrected. March of 2014. We will talk about the responses in a moment. Let's go now to what happened in the other region of Donbas. And what makes it interesting about the Crimea, it's the very first forcible change of territories in Europe since World War II. Huge, huge deal for a continent, at least, that says, that prides itself for having been done with war. No more European wars. Not quite. If you consider even Georgia and the Ukraine to be part of Europe. And that's a matter for discussion, if you wish. Now within the Donbas region, essentially what he did was he sent paramilitaries. We knew that. They knew that. Everybody knew that. They were amassing in the Russian border, and then they slipped into the Ukraine and started an uprising, essentially in regions that they knew that they had separatists, so they would be with friendly people, and they held significant territories that they controlled. The Ukrainian military hit back in order to eliminate the threat, prompted the invasion, again, another peacekeeping operation, by the Russian military to help its Russian speakers in neighboring lands that were killed by the Ukrainians. They call that a genocide. They're still calling it a genocide. They're calling they're accusing the Ukraine of engaging in a genocide. Part of the problem with this, using this term, is if you throw it around so frequently, it loses its meaning. It's not a genocide. It never was a genocide, but it does have traction if you say it. So what happened is the Ukrainians retaliated, the Russians came in, the separatists gained the upper hand, and now it's controlled, the region of Donbass is controlled by Russian separatists. So what's the Western response? And by the way, this is from Marxism.com. To tell you something about what some Westerners believed, certainly what many Russians and others believed over there as well, how sort of the Ukrainian conflict was playing out in 2014. So what was the Western response? We put economic sanctions on Russia. We froze some trade deals. We downgraded their credit worthiness. We created problems with visas. We didn't give as many visas to Russians wanting to come into the country, froze some assets by targeting specific individuals. So far, exactly what we have done now. So what this is telling you is we're not doing something terribly different. It's just much broader, but similar measures, much broader. There were resolutions about upholding the territorial integrity of the Ukraine, and they were kicked out of the Council of Europe. Not to be confused with the European Council, which is a very different organization. So economic ties, the most significant aspect is economic ties continued, primarily because of energy links. Essentially, Europe is dependent on Russian natural gas. I mean, that's it. There's no other way of saying it. And saying no means significant costs to Europeans as well as to the Russians. And the question is, well, who can hold out the longest? What's the political importance now of the invasion today? Number one, it violates the Helsinki Accords. Why is the Helsinki Accords important, of 1975? And why isn't anybody talking about it? Because we have forgotten our history. It was signed in 1975, and it still is the security architecture. It forms the platform of the security architecture of Europe, essentially saying that there is territorial integrity. And all the signatories to this accord actually are going to respect the territorial integrity of the signatory states. The Ukraine was not part of it because it was part of the Soviet Union. In 1990, it was reaffirmed into the post-Cold War era, and that has become the matter of fact. So it violates essentially the territorial integrity, and it constitutes a flagrant breach of security in Europe. A little bit about the economic importance of the Ukraine that helps you understand, well, why should we care? What's the big deal? What's important? Because I'll end up with we should care, obviously. But why? And I'm giving you some facts. There's also other facts. You can figure it out. Second largest reserves in natural gas. It is very helpful to Russia to have access to all of those. Largest uranium deposit, nuclear weapons, hello. Second globally in gallium extraction. Technology critical, very important in electronics. It tells you something. And then the rest of it is titanium. For those of you who have surgeries and need to have artificial limbs, most of them are made of titanium. You probably have some from courtesy of the Ukraine. Iron ore and lithium. We all know lithium batteries. They're very important. So what it does tell you is there are natural resources that are very important to control. So what do we do now? And here is sort of where it gets very interesting and complicated. Number one, NATO has said, reiterated on numerous occasions, we will not fight in the Ukraine. There are no boots on the ground, the end. So all of this that you have heard about President Zelensky appealing, etc., is not going to happen, at least on an official national basis. Individuals going there to fight, that's different. But on an official basis, NATO has said no. But we have sent military aid, we have sent humanitarian aid, etc. And that helps a little bit. Part of the problem, of course, is that all of this stuff is happening now. Well, as they're fighting, it's probably too little too late. All of this stuff should have happened weeks ago so that they could prepare to integrate it into their army units so that they can fight a little more effectively. And part of the problem was, if you did that a few weeks ago, then you would be accused of precipitating the very problem you were trying to avoid, only to find out a few weeks later you were right and you should have done it anyways, in hindsight. So we have targeted individual oligarchs, 2 major banks, but that's important. You know, you have 70% of foreign trade conducted through them, so it does mean something. And my favorite, no Eurovision. So there you have it. There will be no Russians competing in Eurovision or the Champions League final. That's supposed to be in St. Petersburg. It's now going to be in Paris. So there you have it. I'm bumming, but nevertheless, is it a little too late? Probably yes. What do the players want? What does the Ukraine want? The Ukraine wants obviously talks with no preconditions. The idea is we will negotiate for everything, and that's what they're doing as we speak. Apply to become an EU member. You saw the pictures where he signed the application. Will it happen? Not at a time when it will help him. Essentially, this is leverage that he's trying to get, but I don't think he's going to get it. Maybe I'm wrong, because I expect the decisions to be made, that is, the negotiations to end within the week. And I'll tell you why in a minute. What does Russia want? Russia wants unconditional surrender. Essentially, they have the upper hand. They have the troops. They want to oust the current president, establish a puppet regime, carve the country in half. The pro-Russian regions will probably declare autonomy and at some point independence, and somehow they will be annexed into Russia. They will let the rest of them go, but with a puppet regime, it's not going to be as big of a deal to them. At least that's what they want. What does the EU want? It looks very weak and highly unhappy, partly because 1/4 of its oil imports and 1/3 of its gas is imported from Russia. That's the key. You know this statistic, you know everything about Europe, and you understand its response. They're just, unfortunately, dependent on Russia, and they wish they were not. They knew that that was a possibility. There's just nothing they could have done about it. What does the U.S. want? We impose sanctions, we support Zelensky, but we send no troops. So can we push Russia back? The answer is no. Unless you put boots on the ground, it's not going to happen. So we're going through the motions, we're trying to isolate them, and we're trying to force them back, but to make sure that they get as little as possible. Does it hurt? The answer is yes, it hurts, and it hurts for everybody, because it means higher inflation for everybody in Russia and here as well. Actually, prices will rise here, so it will be an economic problem. An EU MP claims that it costs Russia $20 billion a day. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's a whole lot of money to be burning per day. If this thing is prolonged, then that's a problem. That's why Putin wants to end it as quickly as possible, and Zelensky wants to end it as quickly as possible, partly because the more it drags out, the worse it gets for him, the higher the casualties. Essentially, he just doesn't have the capacity, the capabilities to respond adequately. There's lack of access to Western markets in terms of finance. SWIFT is very important because it means that nobody will touch you in terms of trade, and you can't trade, and that's important. There's a fear of a run on Russian banks. That's very important because it means that they'll run out of liquidity very quickly, and we're already seeing that happening. Interest rates hover around 20%. You're too young to remember 20% interest rates. Unfortunately, I am not. It's not a good idea. You don't want that. It means your money is essentially discounted 20% every year. It's essentially inflation. I mean, the interest rate reflects to a very large extent the inflation rate, more or less. And that means you're just destroying the value of your purchasing power every year. Not a good thing. Targeting individual hurts the most, but you've got to target specific elite, which they are doing. Whether that makes a difference sort of in Russia proper, I mean, does it mean that, you know, the people understand this is not against us? The answer is no. But if you hurt the elite, they will put pressure on Putin, and then maybe that will make the difference. That's why they're hurting the elite. The key is developments on the ground. At the end of the day, that's what it is. Will anyone fight the Russians? Also fight the Russians? The answer is no. How long will the Ukrainians hold out? The answer is not very long. They just don't have those capabilities. And so now, what will happen? The war will likely not end, at least, open hostilities will probably end soon at some point. They'll come to some kind of negotiated peace, but open conflict will continue. Tensions will continue. There will be small skirmishes here and there for a very long time to come. And any government, installing a puppet government, you've got to have the support of somebody over there. And that will be the problem. Nobody will have the support anymore of anybody in the Ukraine, in Western Ukraine. Russia. Putin will likely get what he wants. He's exercised his power, he's demonstrated it, and he probably will get it, but at a huge price for his country. And that's part of the problem. Is it worth it? Is it worth it? What you're getting, is it worth the cost that you've put in? He's also threatened others who have helped the Ukraine. That's never a good idea because you're expanding the conflict, perhaps. Does nationalist emotion trump economic hardship? Yes, there is support right now because, these are our lands, et cetera, et cetera. There are Nazis over there, genocide, blah, 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 all of that stuff. But when you see prices in the grocery store going up, will all of that stuff go out the window? We're not exactly sure where the tipping point is for that. Will oligarchs accept losing a whole lot of money? That's the key, in my opinion, because they stand to lose the most. And they have a lot of money, and obviously they stand to lose a lot of money. So where is the tipping point with them? We've seen some already starting to complain about it, but there needs to be far more in order to have an effective pushback. Finally, I think it will become a pariah state. I mean, there is no credibility anymore for Russia. Nobody will believe Putin for what he says. Nothing. And that's a problem if you want to sort of continue with the rest of Europe, because that's where you are and you got to live with them. What does the Europe want? Do you fight power with power? Theoretically, you should. In practice, you can't because you don't have the power. Essentially, Europe does not have the power to counter Russia and Russia's attack. And so it will talk the talk, but nobody will pay attention unless you can hurt them economically. Then, yes, then you start paying attention. That's where the Europeans seem to have a little bit of leeway. They've stopped Nord Stream 2. And that's to the credit of Germany, because it will cost them. It will cost them. But it will also cost Russia. It's a big move and symbolic more than anything else. It needs to find alternative sources of energy very quickly. Good luck with that, because that's not going to happen very quickly. It needs to increase its military might. Good luck with that. That's not happening anytime soon. And it needs to decide about Finland and Sweden. Well, those countries need to decide, but also collectively within the European architecture. Remember, what he said is that they should not join NATO and they should remain neutral. Now, one country tells another what to do. Not a good thing. It essentially smacks of Cold War, especially when it comes to Finland, but to Sweden, no. So it depends on what these countries want. But if I were a member, a citizen of these countries, I'd be leery about what's he have in mind. And would that mean that I am prey whenever he wants or feels like? What do we want? At the end of the day, first of all, a big thank you to the intelligence services. They got it right this time. I mean, 100% right. And that was a good thing because we knew exactly what was going to happen. And whether we believed President Biden or not, it proved that he was absolutely right. And it happened exactly how he said, when he said it. President Biden holds the moral high ground, but he suffers economically. Okay, there will be high inflation, high oil prices, high corn prices. Now, why the hell am I talking about corn here? Because the Ukraine is a very big producer of corn, and there is corn syrup in everything. So corn is very important to our economy, believe it or not. We're hooked on this stuff. And so it will affect us in many ways. Politically, he's on shaky ground, so he needs to do something. Right now, as we speak, I'm competing with President Biden and his State of the Union address. I think I'm winning with this class, but maybe not for very long. There are midterm elections coming up, shaky, 50-50. He needs to do something to gain the upper hand. The Republican response was not only partisan, it was deplorable. I mean, absolutely deplorable how they responded to the invasion and how they turned it into a partisan domestic issue. I mean, I couldn't believe it, especially former President Trump, who said what he said about Putin and also suggested that we do it with our southern neighbor. That's terrible. I mean, he is telling us, former president now, okay, former president, he's telling us to become exactly what we say we deploy. That's awful. That's awful. And he doesn't do justice to himself and to his own party, especially if he's likely to be, we don't know, the presidential nominee for 2024. Remember that. That's important. The country, unfortunately, is indifferent. I mean, yes, we should care. No, we don't care. Partly because it's not happening next to us. This all seems so far away, and it has not been made to make us feel as if it affects us. Hopefully now you're starting to realize, in terms of inflation, you're going to see it at the pump. You've already seen it, actually. I've seen it at the pump. Any of you who put gas in your car will have seen it. You'll see more of it. And inflation at the grocery store, you're going to start to see it. President Biden needs to score a big victory to restore credibility and leadership abroad. And he's got to do something more than just sanctions. I mean, that's not going to help if we want to push Putin back. So I thought I'd give you something to chew on. I have here the front page of the Memphis Commercial Appeal of Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. This Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Notice the difference between Friday when Russia invaded the Ukraine, and you have sort of the news. And then you get into Saturday, where you have Family Dollar and major issues happening there. And finally, Sunday, that we're talking sort of back to the same issues of equality and racial relations in Memphis, etc. What that tells you, and you can see, there is something about the Ukraine conflict, but it's hidden in the back. What it tells you is we have moved away, Middle America, if you like, has moved away from the issue into other things that we normally discuss. That's a problem. That's a huge problem. And we need to address it. And now what? I'll leave you with a good notice. What are you prepared to do about it? How can we do something better, something different, something that makes a difference? Takuya. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
I've seen a lot of stuff on the news today and yesterday about how Russian soldiers have been tricked and that a lot of the young ones don't want to fight, and they're like putting holes in their tanks so that they don't have to.
Sure.
Do you think that that's a lot of just propaganda, or what do you?
I'm sure some of it is. Obviously, I don't know. I mean, the easy answer is I don't know. I am sure some of it is. As a soldier, it would be very difficult to actually do that, especially in battle, because you're dealing with others as well. You're not alone. And if somebody, one of your comrades sees you, they don't necessarily share your feelings. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. And if they see you do that, I have a gun, you have a gun, let's see who's left standing. So some of it, I'm sure, is propaganda. Some of it is not. Some of it is genuine fear. War, yeah, is terrible business. And they didn't sign up for it. Remember that most of them are conscripts. It's like people like you here. You didn't sign up for this. You don't want to die. I understand that. Yes?
Do you think as soon as gas prices start getting affected that it's going to come back into the news? Because like at least in middle America, no one cares because it's not directly affecting us. But as soon as gas prices go up, it's either going to be directed towards Biden because it is middle America, or it's going to be directed towards the Ukrainian crisis.
Well, it would not be the Ukrainian crisis because you can't blame the Ukrainian crisis because it means there's nothing you can do about it. You'll blame Biden because I voted for you, you fix it. And so if it starts going up significantly, now there's a pendulum, they've gone up, they're going down, etc. If it starts to have a serious effect, prolonged effect over time, then yes, the mood of the country will turn sour and it will turn against the Biden administration. Yeah, so he better have a good answer. If I were his advisor, I'd tell him start preparing your speech to tell them why prices are going up and why you are not to blame, but everyone else, whoever everyone else is. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Could you talk a little more about why NATO has decided not to intervene?
Yes. NATO has a clause that says that it will intervene in case one of its member states gets attacked by an external force. It has absolutely nothing that says that we will intervene outside that particular case, that condition. In this particular situation, that condition does not exist, which means that if Putin decides to attack, let's say, Poland, then yes, then that becomes an issue. If he stays within the Ukraine, then NATO does not have a pretext. Can they do so? They can do whatever it is they want, of course. They don't want to do that. Essentially, if you haven't figured it out yet, they're looking for ways not to do it. And this is political cover for them not to do. Now they have mobilized rapid reaction force troops. They're moving into the Baltics and closer to the area of contention. But you're talking about 40,000 troops, heavily armed and all of that stuff, but that's not enough. I mean, to push back, remember, what is your objective? If your objective is to sit around and see what's happening, you're on the right track. If your objective is to push back the Russian troops, well, you've got to move them into the area of hostilities, which they're not going to do. Politically, they've made it very clear. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know, but they've made it very clear. Sir.
I have like two little questions. So the first is like also on the Article 5 NATO on collective defense. Would you see the possibility of the induction of Ukraine into NATO? And the second one, with this whole thing unveiled and then Ukraine losing the leverage over Nord Stream 1 because of the construction of Nord Stream 2, what will be the future for the whole Nord Stream 2 project?
Yeah, the sort of the easy question first. No, I don't see them becoming member of NATO anytime soon, because that would mean that then NATO members have to attack Russia or enter the Ukraine, if you like. And they don't want to do that. So they're not going to do it for that reason, even if they want to. They understand that that will trigger significant security concerns on the part of Russia, and it may create bigger problems that they are not ready to deal with. The second question is a little more complicated. The first part is about Nord Stream 2, and essentially the pipelines that are coming into Europe. Nord Stream 2 is not going through the Ukraine. It's going under the Baltic Sea. But it's the newest one. And essentially what they have done is they have frozen the process of licensing it. So for now, it's not going any further. I mean, that's it. It sort of ended there, which means that if you are a construction company or a managing company, you're losing money because you're essentially hiring all of these people to do stuff that there's nothing to do. They can't do it. What's the future of it? Chances are the company will go bankrupt. Whether that means that another company will take over or there goes the pipeline, I don't know, because that's a lot of money that they will have to waste. I think a different issue will be what's the future of Russian gas imports into Europe. That's the primary concern because they're coming through the Ukraine actually and through pipelines over there. And will Europe continue to import as much Russian gas as it has been in the past? The answer is in the short run, they have no other choice unless they decide we're going to tough it out and we'll take it on the chin for the Ukraine's sake. What that means is that if you have, let's say, 50% of your heating needs, especially your heating needs, coming in from Russia, and all of a sudden you're saying, okay, I'm going to lower my imports by, say, 50%. That's a whole lot of money that now the Russians are losing. They're not going to take it lying down, especially since you already have contracts, I am sure long-term contracts, that specify prices, et cetera, et cetera. So a whole lot of that will depend on how much suffering are you willing to go through. And the suffering needs to entail, well, can you find alternative sources of energy to make up for all the losses if you decide that I'm going to lose from all of this? Because I don't want Putin to win or I want him to hurt because of all of this. The problem is, at least insofar as natural gas is concerned, because then you'll have to retool everything, and that's even more complicated. The answer is you don't have choices. There are three main producers of natural gas, and much of Europe right now is using natural gas, moving away from oil, away from fossil fuels, all of that good stuff. Natural gas is one option. They're trying to move into other options, but that's long term. And the three main producers of natural gas are Russia, the US, so Canada, and we do, and anybody know the third country? Iran. So here is the problem that you have, and that was from the beginning, it hasn't changed. If you don't get it from Russia, and this has been a sore spot between Europe and the US has always been telling the Europeans, watch out, because you're too dependent on Russia, you're not going to be able to respond should something happen. They understood that there are risks involved, but okay, so where do we get it? Do we get it from Iran? Well, absolutely not, because they're pariah, they're this, they're that, so that's not in part of the equation. So the only other alternative is a little self-serving, but you don't have a pipeline coming through, and it will cost significantly more. So they weighed the pros and cons, thought that it could do business with Putin, and that's what you get. So you've got to change now, try to figure out whether it's still worth it or not. I don't know. There's a lot of soul searching that needs to happen over there. Any other questions? Well, yes. Let me ask you then a question. What are you prepared to do about it? I mean, you heard the consequences. You know what's going on. You saw sort of the calculus. You saw what I think, at least, and you draw your own conclusions. Naked aggression, essentially, it's not a question of who's right and who's wrong, at least in my mind. What do you do? What should you do? other than lower your intake of corn syrup. And that'll teach them. So,
I mean, it's going to sound depressing, but you really can't do anything. Like, literally not. So I think basically just spectating is our only option. And we might as well do some constructive spectating and come up with, I guess, a framework where this kind of a situation doesn't occur again, especially as an ISP, as ISPers, as some of us are.
okay, all right. Spectating, essentially sort of following issues, being sorry for the things that you see, the things that are happening, but at the end of the day, going home saying, yeah, I've done my good deed.
Well, obviously, I mean, there are ways to sort of support the communities in Ukraine. Like
Such as?
There are a lot of online fundraisers happening.
Yes.
There are lots of ways you can like donate to them. There are some good organizations working on the ground.
Sure. What's another way that's the more obvious one, actually? Probably has leverage. Believe it or not, you have leverage. And if there's one thing that I want you to get out of this is you have leverage. Yes.
Vote.
Sure, vote. Vote in the midterm elections. In the meantime, what do you do?
I mean, technically, you could call your congressperson from wherever you are. It can be the Memphis one. It can be your representatives from home, wherever that may be, and just kind of say, if there's anything you can do, like, I encourage you to vote because I have taken the calls up in the House and they do take note of it. So that they have to acknowledge your call, even though it's not directly them, it'll be like a staffer, but
Sure.
that's what you could do maybe.
I wouldn't call it technically, I'd call it substantively. At the end of the day, the participation into the political process, the way to express satisfaction or dissatisfaction is essentially through what is termed, what you described as constituency work. I mean, the representatives, the senators are out there to do constituency work in addition to whatever else they're doing. And they will pay attention. They will take notice. They may not agree. I'm not saying that they will do exactly what you ask them to do. Chances are they probably won't, but they need to understand that they have an attentive public. Because if they don't have an attentive public, they'll do whatever they want. And whatever they want is exactly what middle America I have described once. Nothing. They're not interested. They'll go into their own thing and do something else. If you think this is important, and I'm not saying you should think this is important, but if you do, that's the best way to actually make it a little more than just a spectator sport. Try to get something out of it. Try to put pressure on our government to do something more. If you have ideas, even better. If you don't have ideas, you can still tell them, support the Ukraine in its fight against Russia. That's important too, if that's what you want. And I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. You tell your representatives and your senators whatever it is you think is best, but getting involved is the only way to get something out of it, in addition to protests, in addition to lectures, in addition to other things that you may be doing with your student clubs to raise awareness. At the end of the day, raising awareness is very important before you end up going somewhere. Hold on.
What could the United States do that's like going farther than just sanctions and military aid and sending like weapons that isn't as far as putting Americans like boots on the ground?
Okay, how do you stop short of boots on the ground, and how do you increase pressure? Essentially widen the freezing of assets. Economic warfare. That's about the only thing that you can do, because you're not willing to take the military steps. The political steps, I think, have already worked out on their own. For the most part, he's a pariah. You don't have to explain it to people why he is. But economically, it's about making him suffer. The problem with that is, of course, there is retaliation. And that's part of the calculus of the consequences. And then it becomes, well, how far do you want to go with all of this stuff before it starts to hurt you as much as it hurts Russia? I don't know where that line is, but I think there's a whole lot more that our country can and do about it that involves economic consequences, including sort of banning all the SWIFT to and from Russia, banning all the oligarchs, or if I were President Biden, I'd actually have a slightly different view on the oligarchs. I'd free some of their assets, some oligarch assets, but leave others alone. We have them turn against each other, sort of divide and rule. But that's me, Machiavelli. He doesn't have Machiavelli as a prince, so he's got other advisors. Yes, Jay.
I think another thing, in addition to what Roman described about calling Congress people as representatives, I think it's also important to be holding people accountable, especially those in the public sphere, and by that I mean the media and those who have been sort of dispelling a lot of misinformation right now.
Sure.
Sort of having blatantly, airing propaganda on a daily basis, and that includes a lot of US-based media as well. And I think holding them accountable and sort of debugging the mistrust that they're sitting on.
Yeah, sure. I mean, by all means, that's a domestic issue. The information war will continue. I mean, there's no question about it. It was before us, it is now, and will continue afterwards, as everybody's trying to control the narrative. So if you feel that there are specific media outlets that deserve the ire of constituents for spreading falsehoods, etc., let them know. By all means, let them know. And do the best thing. Don't buy from them. I mean, in my opinion, the best way to drive the point home, not the media outlets, unfortunately, is hit them at the wallet. They'll understand that. They may not understand you, but they understand money. Any other questions? Yes.
So how are these sanctions affecting just kind of the everyday Russian citizens and how their life is going on right now?
Well, they're affecting them in that they're seeing prices going up. And so what they don't want is panic. They don't want to run on the banks because that will create a liquidity issue. So what I'm expecting is, because everybody's trying to get their money out, and that's a huge problem. So what I'm expecting is capital controls, just to freeze everybody's assets, and sort of, that you can only get your money then out of ATMs, but only in small amounts. And that's one thing that ordinary Russians will probably have to deal with, but mostly it will hit them at the grocery store, at wherever they have to go, and they'll see the prices going up. Beyond that, part of the issue is, if they decide that this is a problem, who do you blame? That is, you see that, okay, so whose fault is it, and who do you get angry at? Because you will get angry. That, unfortunately, we can't control, and I fear that it will be sort of the West, because we don't want Russia to be, I've heard all sorts of things coming out of ordinary Russians that I can't believe they're saying them. On the other hand, they can't believe I'm saying some of the stuff that I'm saying. So, fearing the US because it meddles in Russian affairs and we don't want them to develop. I don't understand that, but okay. But that's how they feel, some of them at least.
Kind of building off that, do you think that, you talked about how Putin has very high approval ratings, could this be maybe what changes that, or do you not really foresee that happening?
Possibly. I mean, part of the problem is controlling the narrative. You've seen a lot of protests, or at least they've received a lot of attention in our media. I'm sure the Russian media has no idea what protests are you talking about. And part of the deal is you're trying to stifle dissent as much as possible. So all of these guys have been packed and moved out so that it appears as if nobody is complaining about it. And so if you have a whole lot, sort of a critical mass of people who are now starting to talk openly against it, then that's a problem. Currently, at least, that doesn't seem to have been an issue. So will there be a critical mass? So far, it doesn't seem to have been. And given the tight control over the Russian media, I doubt if there will be such a sort of a strong aversion to what's happening. Ordinary Russians understand a whole lot of this stuff. Whether they want to do something about it, that's taking a leap that many of them will probably not want. Because it's also very costly to them too. In terms of their lives too. I mean, not just, you lose X, Y, and Z. You may lose your life. I mean, do you want to do that?
Has there been any consideration using cyber warfare instead of boots on the ground?
Yes, there is consideration. Yes, we have thought about it. Yes, Putin, unfortunately, is a master at it in the sense that they've invested a lot more. They're much better at it than we are. We're now waking up to the possibilities, and we're very vulnerable, at least for now. So yes, I would imagine that one of the lessons that we draw is hire a whole lot of cybersecurity experts to develop defensive, and we will not tell you offensive weapons to get us what we want. But for now, we're not at that level yet, I think. Any other questions?
Okay, well, a lot for us to think about tonight. And even from the great decisions perspective, maybe one thing you could think about, Democrats are divided on this, Republicans are divided. What about the question of selling more arms to Ukraine to further militarize the conflict, right? To further maybe create death and destruction among those involved in Ukraine? So from a great decisions perspective, think about that question, right? Would you support further arms sales to Ukraine, or do you think that's not such a good idea? That's something that our political community is divided, both Republicans and Democrats are. So in the spirit of great decisions, keep thinking about the things that you heard tonight and about things you heard last week, because this is an ongoing conflict. As Professor Zahariadis said, it's not in our back door. It's not close to us. We don't think about it very much, but we have to think about it as citizens, as informed global citizens. So keep that in mind. Also, keep in mind, next week we'll hear from Professor Kurdish, and Professor Kurdish will talk about the U.S. war in Afghanistan. So think about what you heard tonight. Then next week we'll hear kind of the other side, the U.S. 20-year war in Afghanistan. So next week's readings are not from the briefing book. They're going to be on the Canvas site. Professor Kurdish has selected a few readings that she wanted you to take a look at before class next week. So please do read them on the Canvas site, and we'll pick this up next week. So help me thank Professor Zahariadis for his lecture.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.